Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Womack. I'm the Executive Director here at South Texas Botanical Gardens and Nature Center. I want to welcome you to the last of our Wednesday winter lectures. We've appreciated everyone that's tuned in or come in person for these classes. Education is a big part of what we do at the Botanical Gardens. So thank you all for your attendance and so many of y'all that are members. We do have a Saturday lecture series that continues on. It started last Saturday with a pruning workshop. This Saturday, we will have
Harry.
I forgot his first name.
Harry
from Harry Gonzalez from Guild Nursery is going to be here talking about basically giving your landscape a facelift and some ideas that you can do to revitalize your existing landscape. So that's going to be this Saturday at 9:30. We also have a list of upcoming classes, both on our website and if you're here in person at the table as you're walking out. If you're here, make sure you checked your name off on the list over there so we can confirm your attendance or add your name to the bottom if you weren't on that list before you leave this. And with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. We have Cindy Meredith of the Herb Cottage in Hallettsville. Cindy's been a long-time friend of the Botanical Gardens, and she is going to talk today about herbs, growing and using them and preserving them. So kind of a little bit of everything. And she brought lots of herbs here. So if you're done, you can get your first pick to get your herb garden ready to go for this spring if you're in person. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cindy. Thank you so much, Cindy, for coming.
Thank you, Michael. I do love coming to the Botanical Garden. I usually, when I'm done with the talk here, take some time and walk around the garden and see what's happening from the last time I was here. Today, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to do that because of time constraints, but I'll be back when the season changes, hopefully, and see all the new things happening in the garden. I am here to talk about herbs. A real love of mine. I just started growing herbs because I like food and I like to eat, and I live on a large piece of property out of the country, and I had lots of room in an area that was fenced away from cows, and I started growing, and then I learned how to propagate, and pretty soon I had way more herbs than two people could possibly use or plant, even unless I was going to start being a row gardener or a farmer even. So I decided to start a little potted herb business, which that was back in '98. And the little herb cottage that I started has grown and grown, and so here I find myself still growing herbs and loving every minute of it. They're, of course, wonderful plants to deal with because they're aromatic. You can eat them. A lot of them make really nice landscape plants, especially the perennial permanent ones, especially down here. I live up near Hallettsville, so it's a little colder up there, and certain things that you can grow here all year round, barring an unusual weather event like last year, which I'm sure we're all still kind of recovering from, our yards and trees and that kind of thing.
Do you recommend that for down cover also?
Okay, it
Well,
shows him
lemongrass is pretty
unmuted,
tall,
but I just was
and
looking
it
at the
doesn't really
speaker
spread.
to
It's
see
a
if
clumping
maybe
grass,
it's
and the clump will grow larger.
not a little control
It's more of a
bar.
specimen type grass.
Let me see if, stay with me until I can.
Great ground cover,
Get
herbal
this.
ground cover is the creeping rosemary, which I didn't bring any today because I don't have any ready. I pretty much sold
Are you
out
getting anything?
throughout the winter, and new
You
cuttings
hear
aren't
anything?
ready yet. But creeping rosemary, it's not real low. It'll maybe get about this high, before it kind of falls, lays over and runs.
So the prostratus.
Yes. my, the names of the plants, but I'm talking.
I'm
to
just
there's
wondering,
another group.
I was just wondering if it was something in addition that I hadn't.
Oh,
heard.
no, it is. There's different cultivars that are good bred. But
Okay.
yes, it is.
Okay.
For sure.
I'm glad you're dumbing
I was
it
gonna
down
say,
since
I'm-
I'm not a master
Me too.
gardener.
Amen.
Because I didn't know she was talking about
Okay, well, good.
it, let alone spell
I
it.
am a person who really likes botanical names because they're descriptive. And when you learn a few key terms, you'll see that the botanical name will actually describe the plant. You know, longiflora, longleaf, rubra, red, prostratus, prostrate. So,
Yeah, I was cheating. It's a cognate. You think I remember them all? No.
Yeah, she
Okay.
said they can hear now.
okay. Okay, let me just drone on a little bit more about lemongrass because I love it. Even though every year I plant in the ground thinking, well, maybe this year we'll have a mild winter and it'll survive. Last year I did that. In fact, last year I planted a lot of things in the ground just to see if they'd survive. Well, of course, that wasn't the year to do it. But who knew, of course. Some things survived that I was totally surprised. That I thought for sure would be killed off by the really frigid weather we had. And yeah, they were, they died back, but they came back. The lemongrass did not come back. My moringa tree did not come back. And it was pretty well established. So that surprised me because it's come back in the past before, but not from that much cold. We had 9 degrees at my place, so that was so lemongrass is a really nice specimen grass. It clumps, it doesn't run, so and it grows in a really pretty shape. When you let it grow, it'll get maybe 3.5 feet tall. And if it is in a really happy place, it'll get to be a nice big clump. It likes water. It is a grass. I mean, it will survive drought, but it grows better with regular watering, which is really true for most plants other than cacti and a few others, succulent types. But even things that are drought tolerant, that only means they can tolerate drought. It doesn't mean that they really thrive in drought. So besides landscape value, the reason we grow lemongrass is because you can use it in cooking. When you want to use the plant like in a soup or in a stir fry, you cut one of the leaf stalks down near the soil, and this is true whether it's growing in the ground or in a pot. And then you use this hard part that's near the bottom, and you just clip the leaves off. And I then just dry the leaves and use them for tea. It makes wonderful tea. And the way you use the stalk is you kind of pound it. I take the back of a chef's knife and pound it so you're breaking the fibers. You don't want to break it apart because you're going to take it out of your dish after you're through cooking because it's very fibrous. You don't want to eat it. You don't want anybody to crunch down on it when they're eating. So you want to leave it as pretty good sized pieces. Find it at the end and take it out. But by smashing it a little bit, that helps get the essential oils out, which is, of course, where the flavor is. A really easy thing to do with lemongrass is to take a stalk, a piece maybe about this big, 4 inches or so, and put it in a pot of rice when you're cooking the rice. And you get the most delicious, lemony flavored rice that goes really well with seafood. Shrimp is excellent with shrimp and fish. It's a wonderful way to use lemongrass. So I highly recommend, thinking of it as a landscape plant for this area, but also use it.
You said several times in the ground. You mentioned a pot briefly. What size container would that need?
Well, you want to give the plant plenty of room. So this little plant, this is in what's called a quart pot. And these, since they overwintered in these pots, they're ready. Probably what I'll do with these is divide them. So I can put them back in this size pot. So I can bring more with me to market. So I put them in gallons, I can't bring as many because just space in my truck. So I like to keep them in this size pot. But if you bought this plant today, you could easily put this into a 2 gallon. Or
So they can be trained to be kept smaller.
root pruning is the only way to keep a plant smaller. Yes.
Yeah, you were talking about dividing them.
Yeah.
So what do you recommend for dividing the
Well, you would take this
big,
out.
I've
of
got
it.
one about yay big.
Yeah, well, you need to take it. If it's in a pot, you need to take it out of the pot.
Brother.
See this, it's the bottom is completely solid roots. So the way I would divide this, I have a big knife, a serrated knife, and I would take my big serrated knife and just cut the whole bottom of the root ball off. Just slice it off. And then that loosens all these roots. And then you can take really just your hands and kind of pull you, because when you look at it, you can see these individual stalks. They're real close together, but they're individual stalks. So another way to do it, the bottom piece is cut off, would be to lay it on your surface and take that big knife and just start cutting through the root ball. When you get up here from the ground, try and cut in between the stalks, and you'll see it'll start to come apart. Occasionally, one might pull off with no root if they're really close together. You can try and plant that, and it may or may not strike roots and survive. But division is one of the common ways of propagating the West Indian lemongrass. There are 2 varieties of lemongrass that we find in the nursery trade and in food stores. East Indian, which is this one, these are grown from seed. And these are commonly what you find offered by nurseries, because the nursery suppliers can seed them, just like they seed lots of other herbs. So they're easy for them to produce. The West Indian is not grown from seed. It's vegetatively propagated by division or root. Oh, that term just went right out of my head. Where you just take little pieces of the root and plant it, and they come up. And West Indian makes the much bigger stalks. The East Indian, okay, the biggest stalk on this one's maybe a ½ inch across at the bottom, and they'll get a little bigger when the plant gets bigger. But the West Indian will grow stalks easily as big as my finger or bigger around. So a lot of people like those for cooking more because the stalk is fatter and has more of the oils in it, so it has more flavor. But as far as care, it's just the same. And when I was pruning these the other day, a couple of them had flower stalks, and they were way tall. I mean, even on these little plants. So they looked like this. It looked like the seed was ripe. So I cut them off and I saved the seed. I'm going to plant it and see if indeed it was ripe. And because I have grown it from purchased seed before, so. But the West Indian apparently produces sterile seeds, so it does not grow from seed. So lemongrass is just an excellent plant, and like I said, for this area, probably most years going to really survive through the winter. If you would have a really short cold snap, and the tops would die back. Generally, it will come back in the spring. And if the tops freeze back, they've been freeze dried for you. So you can harvest them. And what I do is I chop them up and keep them for tea. So otherwise, when you harvest the leaves, you can hang them. That's really the way I usually dry them, is just hang them and let them dry that way, and then chop them up and keep them in a jar for tea. It just makes the most wonderful tea. Blends well with other herbs for tea. It's wonderful with chamomile. Chamomile and lemongrass tea is so refreshing. It's good cold and it's good hot. And put a little mint in there if you want to. And speaking of chamomile, what a great segue. Chamomile. How many people here have ever grown chamomile? Oh, not too many. And I'm not surprised, because for some reason people don't grow it. It's an annual, so it's seasonal. It likes the cooler weather. So here you could plant it in November or December, and it would be beautiful all winter till it gets really hot. If you keep harvesting the flowers like most annual plants, the plant will keep putting on more flowers until it just gets too hot. And you'll know the plant gets kind of nasty looking and tired, and it's like, all right, just let it go. It's an annual. But even the leaves have a wonderful aroma. In fact, if you ever look in grocery store that might have a nice section of Mexican food stuff, and you see little packages of manzanilla, that's chamomile. The stems and the leaves, not even the flowers. In the European tradition, which is kind of what white Americans tend to follow, it's the leaves or the flowers that are used for tea. And they're very tiny. If you've ever looked at chamomile tea, you see how tiny the flowers are. They're a bear to harvest because they're so small. But growing your own chamomile, I still buy chamomile tea because I can't really grow enough. I mean, I could, but I don't. But I love the plant. It's bright green. It gets about this big, maybe a foot, like a nice bushy foot by 15 inches maybe. And then the little yellow flowers, yellow white flowers just cover the plant. And it's really cheery and it's lovely to have in the garden. It reseeds if you leave some of the flowers on, which even if you're harvesting, you're likely not to harvest every single little flower. Flowers might come out while you're at work or something, and then you miss them. But it's just a wonderful little plant, reseeding annual, cool season, likes lots of sun. So which is nice for us for in the winter. We can go, full sun plant because it's in the cooler season. So I really recommend chamomile. And if you let some of the flowers stay on the plant and let it go to seed, try not to cultivate around that area where the seed might have blown or dropped, because the seed is like that. It is really fine. And if you cultivate around that area, you're liable to bury the seed in your cultivating, and then you won't have it. It won't come out, because even when you seed it on like in flats or something, you just sprinkle the seed on top of the soil, so it needs light for germination. It's one of the ones, and that's because the seed is just it really is like desperate. So I love it though. I find it pops up here and there in my garden, starting around usually in January sometime. It's very cold tolerant, actually. It'll take temperatures easily down into the 20s if it's well established. So that's another thing that I like about it. In general, herbs like good drainage. A lot of people think herbs don't need nutrients in the soil, and that's just not true. They might not need as much nutrient as a pepper plant or a tomato plant or cucumbers or a plant that you're growing for a fruit. But because we're growing them for the leaves and we want as much of the aromatic properties to be in the leaves, we want to give the plant good nutrition. And my favorite way to fertilize or to add nutrition to a garden bed is to just use compost. You don't need to use anything fancy. You can even buy compost if you're not, you don't have a composting operation at your place. Worm compost, if anybody's into that, permaculture is an excellent fertilizer. If you know anybody that raises rabbits, like aged rabbit poop is excellent fertilizer. Chicken, of course. If you're using animal manure directly, you need to let it sit somewhere to cool down. Otherwise, unless you're putting it in a new bed that doesn't have anything in it, and you like if you did it now and you were planning to plant your first plants at the end of March, then you could put fresh manure in those beds and kind of rake it in, and it would be fine in 6 to 8 weeks from now. That's not the end of March, like the end of April. Otherwise, fresh manure is too hot and it'll burn it down. Mushroom compost is really nice. There's a place up near me in Gonzales that's a mushroom farm, and they give away their mushroom compost. You have to go and get it and bring either buckets or a truck or whatever, but you can go and get it by the truckload. But I know people that have gotten it and immediately put it on their garden when they got home, and oh man, what happened? Everything's dying because it was just too hot. So that's always, something you need to consider to like just let it sit. I raise chickens, and I get my chicken manure, but I pile it up in a place and then let it sit for a while before I use it, because otherwise it's just too hot. Drainage, though, is really important for most herbs. Some are not as picky as others. Chives are not as picky for drainage, nor is parsley. Chamomile, for that matter, is not real picky about drainage. But the herbs that we consider to be Mediterranean type herbs, like rosemary, thyme, oregano, is considered a Mediterranean herb, but I have found oregano to be very easy to get along with. It really just grows in whatever conditions I happen to put it in. But if you're ever trying to grow lavender, it likes really good drainage. And those are the main ones, really. But, like most plants, they don't like to sit in soggy soil. There's an exception. Ha! Isn't there always an exception to every rule? Horsetail. Equisetum mare. Thank you. This it's a bog plant. Now it'll grow in a pot. Duh, it's growing in a pot. But you can grow it in a bog or in a water garden. I have a water garden, and my mother plant for horsetail lives in my water garden. And I have it in a big container full of just dirt that I dig up out of the ground, not potting mix or anything, but just dirt. And so it's heavy, and keeps the pot in place for one thing. And I generally keep some rocks on top of it to kind of keep the soil from floating out. And I put it in I have a little shelf that runs along one edge under the water in my garden. So the horsetail goes on that shelf, so the water doesn't come over the top of the pot. The water, I mean, it's a big pot, but the water maybe only comes up an inch or two below the top of the pot. So the roots are in the water all the time, but the crown of the plant is kind of up out of the water. And it seems to be very happy there. It gets thick and makes lots of new growth, so that about every 6 months I could take it out, which is a job because it's very heavy, and of course it's down low and you have to lift up. Anyway, and then I just divide it and put it in pots for sale. And the other thing, you can grow horsetail in your garden, but it runs. You will, if you put it just out in your garden or your landscape, it'll just run everywhere. All of a sudden, 15 feet away, you'll see a horsetail coming up. I mean, it's not unattractive, and it doesn't really bother anybody. It's thin, and you know, it doesn't really shade anything out. But some people don't like that type of garden where things are just here and there.
You said it's a bog plant. To me, bogs are acidic and, you know, I think peat bog. Is it pH or salt fussy? Is it going to bother with city water or clay?
Well, clay, no.
Okay.
City water, I cannot answer. I live on a farm. We have hard as hell well water.
Okay.
I mean, so alkaline, you know,
And plenty salt.
it eats our faucet.
And the ice.
Yeah, we're always replacing seals in our faucet because the alkalinity of our water is so strong.
What do you use horsehair for?
Horsetail is generally
horsetail.
a medicinal, used as medicinal herb. In Chinese medicine, they use it for eye disease, and to tell you the truth, I don't really know how it's used, whether it's used as a tea or if they make a tincture out of it. The other thing you can do is if you have a nice thick clump, there's silica in the leaves. The leaves feel so cool. They don't really even feel like a real plant. And you can take a handful like this, if you would want a much thicker handful. Now these stems are really new, so they're thin. Horsetail will grow eventually with stalks, maybe a quarter of an inch in diameter, so nice and thick. And you grab a handful and you cut them off and you hold them that way, and you can use them to clean pots and pans, and like if you're out
In Iroquois
in the
medicine,
wilderness.
the sap is mixed with a light bit of water, and that is used to wash wounds. It's a coagulant.
It's a coagulant.
Yes.
Thank you. So they just mix the
The
stalks,
sap with a little bit of water.
the stalks.
Well, you crush them to make a poultice.
Yeah.
And then you use the liquid from that, not the crushed leaves, because the silica's
Too harsh.
right,
Yeah.
yeah. But then you wash the wound with that water.
Cool.
But it has to be fresh because a lot of enzymes break down over time.
Yarrow is another one that's good for that. The native yarrow. I don't know about the fancy ones they sell at nurseries in different colors and stuff, but the white native yarrow has been used for as a styptic for wounds for centuries. So
Can we pass that around? I want to feel it too.
I'm just.
I promise I won't jump on everything, but that's one that's obscure and I knew it.
Well, I appreciate that because I always need to look it up, but it's one of those things I just don't get around. I brought some other ones that you might not be as familiar with. I mean, you're familiar with parsley and chives and, I have one basil with me today because I actually bought this one in. And, this is called Perpetuo. You might have seen this at the nursery. Been in the trade a few years now. It blooms very seldom. So it's nice because you're not always having to cut off the blooms. And it's a tall, thin plant rather than kind of a big monster. And of course, it has wonderful basil aroma. So I did bring basil. And basil, of course, likes a lot of sun. It likes water, but it will survive some drought. It droops when it's not happy, so you'll notice. And most of the basils, how they just flower all the time. What I like to do is I like to keep the flowers cut off to keep the leaf production. And the best way to do that actually is to harvest your basil. Harvest down a third to a half of the length of the stem before it starts getting real woody. Older basil plants, yes, they'll survive, but they tend to get woody. And in my estimation, the leaves get smaller and the flavor's not as good as when you have a nice fresh plant. So basil seed is cheap. It's nice to keep seeding basil throughout the season so that you have fresh basil to put in the garden as the older ones kind of start to get woody and fade. If you leave those basils, however, to flower, they make wonderful destinations for pollinators. Bees, butterflies, little tiny wasps that don't sting us or anything, but they're little tiny beneficial wasps go to the basil plants, and you're really helping the wildlife and the insect population if you leave some of that basil to flower and then have fresh plants that you raise to put in for your own use. And then I know sometimes they can get a little raggedy looking in the garden. So once the flowers have really started to fade, unless you're growing it for seed, and then you have to leave it even longer, then it's a good time to take it out. But leave the flowers for the little pollinator insects that are so helpful to us. Okay, here's a quiz. Does anybody recognize the leaves of this plant? Can you see it pretty well? They're out there. They're coarse. They're not aromatic. Okay, I'll give you some more hints. The plant gets quite large. It's an annual. It's a cool season annual. And it has blue flowers. Anybody ever hear of borage? Or borage, B-O-R-A-G-E. Some people pronounce it borage. Not in America. Borage. Anyway, borage is another fabulous butterfly bird. Used to be used for medicinal purposes. Not many herbalists use it anymore because there are other plants that kind of do the same thing. I love it. It gets really big. The leaves are rough and kind of coarse. The flowers, as I said, are blue. They come up in little sprays, and then the little heads hang down. Oh, they're so cute. And if you have time for this kind of thing, you can pick the flowers, mix up some egg whites, a little paintbrush that you didn't use to paint with. Paint the little flowers with the egg whites, and then gently dip them in sugar. and let them dry on some wax paper or something. And you have little candy forage flowers to put in your champagne. The other thing people do is they freeze the flowers in ice cubes, especially if you have the kind of fridge that makes clear, nice, clear ice cubes. Forage flowers look really cute in there. The leaves have sort of a cucumbery flavor, but they're so hairy. Every time I read about borage, I read people eat the young leaves. Ooh, I don't, even the young ones are hairy. But you can use it in like water. If you're making cucumber water or herb water, just, not tea necessarily, but just like you take a pitcher of water, and I do this a lot in the summer, and just put herbs in it, put it back in the fridge, and then you have some nice aromatic water to drink during the day rather than just plain tap water. And depending on the herbs you choose, of course, you get different flavors, you get different health benefits. If you use some of the more powerful medicinal type herbs, you can use chamomile, you can use lemongrass, lemon balm works really well. Borage leaves will help give it a little cucumbery flavor, and that way you can use them, but you're not getting this little hairy aspect of the leaves. You could use them also in herb vinegar for a cucumbery flavor. It's a really fabulous plant, and it also is another one that will receive. Mine received pretty well, again, you don't want to cultivate around anything you want to receive. You can't do a lot of cultivating around that area because you end up burying the seed too deep. But borage is really, it's an underused plant in the garden, I think, because it's really nice. You can grow it in a big pot if you don't have space in the garden for it. Speaking of cucumbers, oh, love how this is working. Okay. Anybody, this one's kind of hard to see. Anybody recognize this?
I forgot the name, but I used to grow it. It's wonderful. It's beautiful. It's big.
Salad burnet.
Burnet, yeah.
Salad burnet. It's a cucumber flavor.
I'm like, it's not Jacob Flattery, it's the other one.
Yeah, I've never grown that one. I love salad burnet. It loves the winter. The flavor is best in the cool weather. In the hot weather, it gets kind of bitter. It'll keep growing. It's a evergreen, I would call it. It survived 9 degrees in my garden, like it didn't even know that it was 9 degrees. I came out like in the next day and looked around at my garden, and my salad burnet, which at that time was about this big around, thick, just a gorgeous plant, makes this big rosette. And it was just there, green and happy and cold. What cold? Was it cold last night? So it's really a fabulous plant to grow. Like I said, it's not as flavorful in the warmer months, but it will keep growing, or it'll just kind of hang in there. It doesn't really grow during the hot weather. But if you keep it, just mildly watered, it'll keep growing, stay alive, and then in the fall, it'll kind of put on new growth, and then you taste it and you can see that the flavor's gone back to its really nice cucumbery flavor. It's a nice herb to use in salads if you like cucumber flavor, and if there's somebody who's going to eat this salad who gets indigestion from cucumbers, which is not an uncommon thing. So it's really a nice addition to that, because it's just a cucumber mimic. There's nothing related to cucumber about it. So somebody who has a problem with digestion and cucumbers would have no problem munching the salad burnet. I like to put it in my herb vinegar mixes too, because it adds a nice flavor. When I don't have orange available, I use salad burnet. Okay, I want to talk about this plant that I only brought I don't have a lot of them right now, 3 of them. And I'll tell you right now, Michael put dibs on one when I was carrying them in, so there's 2 available. And does anybody know what this is? You know what this is?
Moth mullen.
Mullen, yeah. What did you call it?
Well, there's 2 species of mullen. We call that the moth mullen up north.
Oh, yeah, you're right. It is some, I've heard it called that.
There's also a one with smaller flowers, and it's a smaller plant overall.
Yeah, this one, I don't know how well that one would do down here.
Yeah, that one's more of a garden variety.
Yeah, this mullen is its common name. It's in the Verbascum family. And it's got really soft leaves. Another nickname for this is prairie toilet paper.
Toilet paper. Toilet paper. We call it toilet paper.
During the pandemic, when there was no toilet paper at the stores, I told my husband, never fear. I've got all this mullen growing in the garden. And he's like, oh, great. He doesn't really, Little House on the Prairie is not his thing.
It's a huge
So
weed,
anyway,
that's what it is.
mullen grows into a huge rosette. It's a biennial, which means the first year it grows into this beautiful big rosette, and the leaves can get this long. I mean, they're this wide. They're beautiful, and because of the hairs on it, in some conditions, light conditions, it looks absolutely silver, especially if it's been foggy and the moisture is captured in the little hairs on the leaves, and then the sun comes out. Oh, it's really beautiful. And then the second year, or even later the first year in my garden sometimes, it sends up a huge flower stalk that is covered in tiny little yellow flowers. They don't all open at the same time. They kind of open from the top down. So it's a medicinal herb, basically. The flowers are often infused into oil and used for earaches. And this has been done for hundreds of years. And especially people with children. I have no children, so I can't verify this. But people whose kids get earaches a lot and who want to use more natural remedies swear by mullen flower infused oil. The leaves make a delicious tea, and the tea is used for respiratory problems, congestion, and even if you have a lot of phlegm, kind of works as an expectorant. Some of the herbalists that I follow online live up in the Northwest, like Oregon and Washington. And last summer, of course, there were horrible fires up there. And they were working on tea blends that people could drink to soothe their mucous membranes and their lungs and everything, because people were just living with all this smoke in the atmosphere for weeks on end. And even if you stay in the house as much as you can, I mean, nobody's house is hermetically sealed. So, people were really suffering from smoke inhalation, basically. And mullen was one of the herbs that they used in their tea blends.
Your earache people may have something. NIH says it has antibacterial and anti-tumor properties.
Okay.
I had to verify that one. That was one I hadn't been.
Right. Well, I don't know about anti-tumor properties. So, I mean,
There are multiple articles that stand by it.
yes, I'm not saying that. It's just that there's always more behind. When you just read a statement like that from any source, there's always more behind it.
I look for biochemistry.
Okay, good.
It's not a mechanism, it's not true.
Okay, that's good. That's okay. So to grow mullen, it'll grow pretty much anywhere. It does have a long taproot, so if you want to try and transplant it, if it's if you let it go to seed, it'll just kind of come up wherever because the seed stalk is so tall. And once the seeds dry and get ripe, the little capsules that they're in open up. And then when the wind blows, the seed gets sprayed here and they're real tiny, and there's thousands of them. So if you grow mullein and you don't cut off flower stalk before that happens, you might have mullein anywhere like I do, and I love it. I let it grow pretty much anywhere it wants to, unless it's really in the way. To dig and move a large mullein plant, though, is near impossible because you'll never get the taproot and the plant won't work. But like this size plant, I dig them up at this size, pretty in my yard and pile them up. So I don't need 100 mullein plants growing in the yard. 10 is plenty. But anyway, it's a really dramatic plant and it needs a lot of room because the base gets really large. But it's definitely a conversation piece. And when people see it, they're just, what is that? Because it's so spectacular and it's so big. And the flower stalk will get taller than me. I'm 5.5 feet tall. Flower stalk will get some of them 6, 7 feet tall if the plant's really happy. Does it need all the sun? It grows in full sun, even in the summer, even in Texas. It is not an actual native to America. It's brought here. A master gardener from another area told me what they learned in their master gardener group was that the seeds of mullein, the way it got here, I assumed that settlers brought it from England. But she said, and I like this idea better, that the seeds were caught in the wool of sheep that were brought here. And that's how the seeds got here. So it probably could be some of both, my guess. But it has escaped cultivation. People tell me it grows wild up in the hill country. It grows wild in the prairie states. So a lot of people think it's a native because it does grow wild, but it's more of an adapted plant rather than an actual native. I mean, it's not native to here originally, but it is a fabulous plant. And if you're into unusual specimen plants, mullei's definitely one to go ahead and grow. Okay, one more thing I want to talk about is growing lavender. And I know that here in South Texas, the closer you get to the coast, the more persnickety lavender becomes. There are several ways to combat some of the issues that we find in high humidity areas to grow lavender. And it is the humidity that really lavender doesn't like. Lavender can take lots of dry heat, but it's the humidity that it really doesn't like. So the first thing is to know what variety you're growing. Not all nurseries pay attention to what varieties they're getting, unless they're specifically tuned in to herbs. And I can't say, like here in Corpus, I've been to Gill's and Turner's both, and to tell you the truth, I was looking for succulents, not herbs. So I didn't really pay a lot of attention to what their herb selection was. So I can't say whether, they would for sure have good varieties that do well here. But over the years, I've tried lots of different varieties. And so I have kind of narrowed it down to ones that I find do well the further south in Texas you get. And the ones that do well are actually hybrids. They're the lavandins, Lavadin. And they do have true lavender or lavandula vera or angustifolia. in their parentage, but they have, a lot of them are crossed with the French lavender. And this one especially, this is called Goodwin Creek. This was developed in Oregon at a nursery called Goodwin Creek Nurseries, and they are known for their lavender. And you can see this has the edges of the leaves are what they call dentate, meaning they're juiced, cut, dentate. And this one does extremely well in the humidity. Another one, I don't know, I'm so low on lavender, on bigger lavenders right now. I think I just brought this variety. Aside from the variety, lavender likes really good drainage. Really, really, really good drainage. It really doesn't like wet feet. So if you live where the soil is heavy, my recommendation is to grow your lavender in a nice, beautiful, big container with lots of drainage. Use a good potting mix that can drain well. And in the winter, give it all the sun it wants. In a container, then in the summer, when it starts to get really hot, move it where it gets afternoon shade. Because even though lavender grows in fields out in the sun, that's not in Corpus Christi. And lavender in the ground, of course, will be more tolerant of heat than anything in a container. And this is kind of a caveat for pretty much any herb you're growing in a container, even an herb that can take full sun in the ground, like rosemary, for instance. If you're growing it in a container, once it starts to get really hot and stay really hot at night, move that container where it gets really shade from noon on at all possible. Or grow it in dappled light. Lavender blooms in the late spring, early summer. So it blooms before it gets really, really hot here. I mean, really stinky hot. It's already hot, but really hot. And then you can move it into the shade because the more sun it gets, the better it blooms. So that's why you want to have it in the sun during the winter when it's thinking about doing its thing to make flower stalks. And then once it's through flowering, it doesn't need all that sun. And if you've ever had a container plant that is out in the full sun in the summer, and you stick your finger in that soil, it will almost burn your finger. And think of the pork roots in this plant. I mean, they're just getting seared inside there. So that's why I really recommend any containerized herbs, certainly, to get that afternoon shade or dappled light. I move all my herbs into places that have shade in the summer, especially anything that's in a little pot like this, because that gets so hot. In fact, last year I bumped a lot of the herbs I had left after spring into this size pot, and they did much better over the summer than they do in these little 4-inch pots. So that was a good lesson learned. Always learning. Okay, I guess if you have any questions, more questions, yes.
Mr. Lavender, do you dry your flowers before you use them into?
Okay, the question is, do I dry the flowers before I use them? Yes, I do. Unless I'm going to cook with them right away, I like to put lavender buds in my brownies. Lavender and chocolate go really well. Just saying. A tablespoon of lavender buds dried, or about 2, and then like with most dried herbs versus fresh herbs, you want to use about twice as much fresh as you do dried. So the recipe that I made up, I've been consistent. I put a tablespoon of dried lavender buds in like just a brownie mix, or a batch of brownies like that makes what 8x8 pan or something. If you're using fresh lavender, you want to use closer to 2 tablespoons, but you can certainly use them fresh. The reason we dry herbs at all is to preserve them. In a lot of places, nothing grows during the winter. So they have no rosemary, they have no thyme plants growing out in the garden. They don't have the plants that we have all year round, like parsley or oregano or chives or this celery. This is cutting celery, grows beautifully in the winter and even into the summer as well. So that's why people started preserving herbs, was so they had them, because there's 3 feet of snow outside and the ground is frozen. So pine trees, that's pretty much all they might have. So you can pretty much dry any herb that that you want. Some people like to dry their herbs just to have them in the kitchen because it's more convenient. Which is fine. I mean, whatever makes it more convenient for you. The old adage, you should plant your herb garden near your kitchen, the door closest to your kitchen, so that you will go outside and harvest them, hopefully. But freezing is a good way to preserve a lot of herbs. Dill freezes really well if you just cut the flower heads and some of the leaves off and just put them in a plastic bag and put them in the freezer. You can use them then in canning that way, or in food. You chop them up and use them that way. A lot of people preserve basil in oil, and even then keep it in the freezer because it's not sterile. It'll mold eventually if you don't keep it in the freezer. But because it's oil, it's not frozen hard like water. And then if you want to use it, the oil then is flavored from the basil. You can just take a spoon, kind of scrape off what you need, and that makes a great sauté oil, even a oil to add to a salad dressing because it's already flavored with basil. Pesto is basically a way to preserve basil. It's a little more complicated, but it's a great way to preserve basil. I don't dry a lot of herbs because I have them. I mean, I don't really see the need to. Although sometimes I do collect seed like dill seed or fennel seed to have in the cupboard, because the dried seed doesn't hang around forever. So if you want it, you have to harvest it when it's ready. And this year I'm going to try growing cumin. It grows kind of like carrots. I know it's an annual. So I want to see. I've never grown it before, so it looks pretty, and I think it would be fine to have my own cumin seed. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Cilantro, I cannot get that to grow down.
Okay, the question is about cilantro. Cilantro is tricky in Texas because it really doesn't like hot weather. So if it would stay cold, we have better cilantro. Then we have 10 days of cool weather and 5 days of 70s and 80s, and then back in the 40s and 50s. And every time it gets warm, that spurs the cilantro to put up its flower stalk and set seed because it doesn't like the hot weather. So the thing with cilantro is, if you have a good plant growing, try and use it. And a good way to preserve cilantro, a lot of people use it dried. I personally don't think it's very good dried. You can make pesto out of cilantro. You can mix it with parsley, makes a nice pesto. Another way to preserve cilantro, all these preserved herbs, of course, you can't use them the same way you would use fresh, like cilantro. If you preserve it, you can't use it in a fresh pico de gallo because preserving it in a sense cooks it. But if you have a lot of cilantro growing, chop it up and put it in ice cube tray. Remember ice cube trays? So fill the ice cube tray with the cilantro, boil some water, and gently pour the hot water into each little ice cube tray, little compartment, and do it really gently. Otherwise, the water comes in and the cilantro comes out all over your counter, and it's a big mat and it's hot. So just pour really gently, and the hot water blanches it, so it helps keep it really green. And then stick it in the fridge overnight, and then the next day put it in a plastic bag and write cilantro on it because you won't remember what it is. And then you have a really nice cilantro flavor to add to anything cooked, like taco soup or tortilla soup or a tamale pie or anything. But like I said, it's not the same as fresh. Beg your pardon?
Ranchero beans.
Pinto beans.
Oh, yeah. So anyway, that's one way. And you can also do cilantro and oil the same way you can do basil. Yes.
Do you ever microwave leaves to dry them?
The question is, did I ever microwave these to dry them? No, I have not. I've read about it, and apparently it works. You have to really watch you have to watch. I have a little dehydrator, so I use that a lot, especially once it gets warm or humid. My house is not air conditioned, so if it's humid outside, it's humid in my house because we always have the windows open. So once it gets really humid in the warm weather, it's really hard to dry things because it's not dry, the air's not dry. So I have an inexpensive little dehydrator. It's on when you plug it in, and it's off when you unplug it. And it has 6 little trays, it's square, about this big, and I don't know how many herbs I've dried. I dry my mullein leaves in there because they would never dry in my house. They mildew before they would dry. So I tear them up, make smaller pieces, and just lay them in there, and they dry really nicely. But yeah, people do, they do. Here's a really interesting way to dry herbs. Take a paper towel, chop your herbs up. Well, you don't want to chop them too fine, but break them up a little bit. Roll them up in the paper towel, and you might want to write on there what it is, because once it's dry, you don't can remember parsley or celery leaf or whatever. Put it in the refrigerator. Now, this is assuming you have a frost-free refrigerator. Frost-free refrigerators, the reason they're frost-free is because they pull the humidity out, right? That's why you have that little drip pan under the fridge. What happens is they dry inside the paper towel. Don't put it in a plastic bag of it. You stick it on the shelf in the fridge. And it'll dry, and they'll dry. And like a week or so, check it whenever you want, unroll it and see if it's dry, if it's really dry. Otherwise, roll it back up and put it back in the fridge for a few minutes. And you don't have to do anything. They just dry. And then you want to store them like in a plastic container or a plastic bag or somewhere where the air doesn't get in. Thank you for attending, and I hope to see you in person.